Benavides, Dr. Yates, Daniel Yates. He was a big helper in putting this program together. I think that he deserves a round of applause for everything that he's done for this community and for this book that is going to be presented to us on December the 12th. Dr. Daniel Yates, historian and author.
This project, as you know, began 3 years ago when Connie and Mary McDonald and Tracy Parker started taking interviews. They did over 30 interviews, some in Spanish, some in English. And then they were all transcribed, which took a long, long time to do. And so that was our starting point. The reason that this is important is that if you look around in the museums, libraries, all over the state, there is practically nothing about Hispanics, about Latinos, about Mexicans, about Mexican Americans that is just impossible to find. And so we began digging. Let me give you some idea of the problem that we face. There are only 2 widely acceptable books on Latinos in Michigan and Mexicans. This is one. It runs 100 pages. You can practically see through it. It's so small. And the other one is called Mexicans and Mexican Americans in Michigan, and that deals with the Detroit area mainly, even though despite the title. So there's practically nothing out there. And so we started digging. Now, the reason that, or one reason Dr. Benavides is here, is that he is our savior. Not in the usual Christian sense of savior, but he was here back in the 70s, 1970s. He was the assistant director of El Latino Central and working on his doctoral dissertation. So he interviewed people who are now gone. They've died, gone away 15, 20 years ago now. And so he gives us a bridge to the past. He was able to interview a man who had come here back in around 1920. And he interviewed other people who have now gone. And so he gave us information we did not have. It simply did not exist. And then from there, we started digging around in other places. This is the Muskegon City Directory. And this was my Bible during those early years. I know every page of this because this is where I found out where people lived. And all I had to go was by their names. And of course, they moved around some, so I probably missed a great number of them. We have them for other years as well. This is 1944. So we started with that. And so between the dissertation of Dr. Benavides, city directories, the interviews that we took, not I didn't take, but the other folks took 3 years ago, that's how we pieced together this material. It had originally been meant to be just a study of Ryerson Heights. But that was not the only community in Muskegon. Back during the World War, Second World War, I'm going to see if this works. Arrows. We were able to, this was called the Arsenal of Democracy, and the area attracted huge numbers of workers to work in the various plants. Now, they came from different places. Some of them, as you can see, were migrant workers who had worked in Oceana County, Newaygo County, Ottawa, Muskegon County. And so the various companies like Campbell-Wine Cannon and Lakey Foundry and others would send out recruiters to these different farms and basically inform the workers there that there were better jobs and year-round jobs working in places like Muskegon. And this was all over the state. I mean, there were many, many other arsenals of democracy, Flint, Saginaw, Detroit, Dearborn. But this is where many of the early comers arrived. Now, this one is in here. Now, again, Dr. Demos fixed this up to some extent, but this shows you the other government housing projects that were in Muskegon at that time. Up at the top is Rudderman Terrace. That's still there. That was built in 1941, just before the war began. As you take a look there, all of the streets have military-sounding names like Defense and Convoy and so forth. Those were permanent housing, and for about 500 families. They had some temporary housing, but most of it was permanent. That's right near, well, it'll be not too far from Lakeside. The people living there were almost always European Americans. There were a couple of Mexican families living in there, but not very many. At the bottom, you see Muskegon Heights, and over to the right-hand side was the area that had housed the African American housing project, which was Fairview Homes. There's a housing project there today, but those buildings are not the same as they were back in the 40s. Those were meant to be temporary buildings, but they were used for 20 years, never torn down until relatively recently. Now this next, I think we have the next map. This shows Ryerson Heights at the top. If you know the city, there's Getty Street going north and south to the left of Ryerson Heights. A bit to the north is Marquette, and then a bit south of that is Wesley. Those streets are still there. In fact, this location is still there. If you go back into that area, you can see the foundations of those buildings even today. They're concrete slabs. They were built on slabs. 45 units were located in there. When I first started looking at this, all the informants, now again, they were 2 and 3 years old at the time they lived there, they said, well, the whole place was Hispanic. Everybody living there was Mexican American. And so I got out the city directory. I remember the day we were at Hackley Library, and I said, well, you've got to look at the city directory, find out who lived there. And it turns out only 7 of the 45 units were occupied by Hispanic names. So they'd forgotten about all those Appalachian whites who were living throughout the rest of the unit. But again, I can see where they were misguided because they were only 3 or 4 years old. First of all, I mean, what do I remember when I was 3 years old? But the other thing is that this became the Mecca for Hispanics every time they had a party. I mean, this was the big center, so if you lived anywhere in the city or even the county, and you knew there was going to be a party on Friday night or Saturday night, that's where you would wind up. So I imagine on certain days you'd see hundreds of people, maybe that you'd never seen before. So that was the main center for Hispanics in the war. Now down at the bottom you see the East Broadway area, and that's where the other segment of Hispanics lived. But those were mostly rental homes, and a few people had bought houses in that area. And again, an area where many other Appalachian Heights were living. So a sort of a mixed neighborhood. That's basically the vicinity of, well, Sherman, that'd be about where the Mercy Hospital is today, and you see Broadway and you see Summit down a bit to the south. There's still many families living in that area. Going back to the top map, if you go to the far right, that was the last of the government housing projects called Forest Homes. If you know where the Sons of Norway is, I've been to the Sons of Norway many times. I'm a little Norwegian myself, you know. Well, the road is still there, and their headquarters, the community building is still there, but it's called the Sons of Norway now. And there were many, many houses back in there, all given names of trees, like pine and spruce and so forth. That was mostly, entirely for veterans' families. If you were in the military, you could stay there. And it was a very nice facility. And there were Mexican-American families in there as well. But according to the information we found, they didn't like it there because they didn't know very many people. They all spoke English, and they didn't care for that. So they pretty much all moved back over to Ryerson Heights because they were around people they knew, they had a culture that they knew about, they spoke a language they understood. So many of those families wound up at Ryerson Heights also.